Our next thread is titled, Would You End It? Would you end your relationship if you couldn't agree on whether to have more kids or not? We just had our first in February and we love our adorable little ones so much, but becoming parents has been the hardest thing we have ever faced. Baby was colicky, I was suffering so much depression, feeling like I was left to do everything alone. We were fighting like crazy the first couple of months after baby. It's getting better, but we aren't the affectionate couple we used to be, and I'm so sad about it. He says he never wants any more kids, but I still want to experience pregnancy again in the future and would love to give our baby a sibling. It's not a rush at all, but he's saying his opinion so matter of fact, like it's never happening again. He made a little joke or remark about how, quote, he's never dealing with my pregnant again. And I know he said it in a joking manner, but he's really not joking, and it actually really hurt my feelings. And I've been thinking about it a lot. Is this something worth ending a relationship over? So I'm going to respond to this one in two different ways. On the one hand, would you end your relationship over disagreeing about the number of kids that you want to have? And on the other hand, what OP should do here. So what OP should do, I think, so this was posted in June, and she says that they had their baby in February. So their baby is like 3-4 months old. That's a really short period of time. That is a short enough period of time that I would argue it's quite difficult to be able to make any long-term decisions about having babies or not. Although I say this, I'm one person who had my baby, and then a week later I was like, I'm ready for the second one, which is not because it was so easy having a baby, but because I enjoyed the experience so much that I kind of wanted to relive it. And I was a bit sad that the whole pregnancy birth experience was over so quickly. That was my personal experience. However, I think for the majority of people, if you're struggling, and especially if having a baby changed your relationship so much that you're having a lot of arguments and you haven't really quite settled in and found your groove yet as parents, then I think it's just too soon and a little bit too early to be making any drastic decisions about whether you should be staying in this relationship in the long run or not. So if I were OP, I would wait a much longer period of time. That's one part to it. The other part to it is, I think that their communication in this relationship is not going super well. When she says here, he made a little joke or remark about how he's never dealing with my pregnant. But again, I would probably say that that's a very clear sign that maybe there was a lot of conflict throughout the pregnancy as well. And neither of them are quite over exactly what that experience did to their relationship and how they interacted with each other. The fact that this hurt her feelings, I would probably address that. And I think I would probably have a serious conversation about pregnancy, how the pregnancy was managed, how the first few months went, and what you would want to do differently in future, if possible. Because, every pregnancy is different and every child is different, but maybe as some kind of foundation that within your relationship you're on more solid ground before you start mixing things up with adding more kids into the mix. That's how I would approach this. I don't think I would already start considering ending my relationship over it unless there were way bigger problems happening here. That's what I would do if I were OP. With regards to the actual question, I think it's a really, really interesting question. I personally would probably say it depends to what extent, like how big of a gap is there, and who is not willing to compromise, or how did you end up in a position where neither party is really able or willing to compromise? And I think that that's kind of where the crux of the matter is. So let's say if I want to have 5 kids and my husband wants to have 1 child, then that's such a huge, major difference in expectations that I would probably question, how did we get to this point where we disagree to such a large extent? And I find it kind of hard to imagine that if you disagree to a huge extent about the number of kids that you want to have, then can you really agree on all other values that are really relevant and important and major for you? As an example, a lot of people will say that the maximum number of kids that they want to have are 2. And their explanation will be something along the lines of overpopulation. If we have 2 children, then we're just replacing ourselves in the great scheme of things when it comes to population. Therefore, that's okay. Now, to me, this type of reasoning is so far away from anything that I could comprehend or agree with that I would question how am I on the same page with my husband if this is how he's thinking? Does that make sense? So I think to some extent, the reason for the refusal makes a lot of sense. Now, a lot of people will say something along the lines of, hey, it's because the person who does not want to have kids is the one that decides. Like, the deciding factor is not wanting to have kids, because if the other person wants kids, then it's like, it's too bad. You can't force kids on a human being. It's like, yes, of course, you can't force kids on a human being. It is completely within both parties' rights to say, we have absolutely no interest, or I have absolutely no interest in having more children. And that's completely fine. But if there is such a major difference, then I would just question, can you be possibly happy as a couple in the future? Now, when it comes to would you end it, I would probably seriously consider it under two circumstances. If the difference is really huge, so if it's something like I want 3 kids, he wants 2 kids, and then we settle on 2, then I'm fine with that. That's not a big deal. But if the difference is very big, then that's a major source of conflict. And if there was really no way to compromise, no way to change it, if the other person is really so strong in their perspective that there's no way to move towards each other. Because I would say that if you cannot compromise on this, and this is a really major problem, and I think I would also most likely consider how many kids you already have. So if it's just 1 child, which I assume is the point at which you would have this disagreement, if it's just 1 child, as if having 1 child is a little thing, it's not, it's a huge thing. But would I end a marriage that has lasted 20, 30 years, where we've already had, 3 kids, because I want 1 more and he doesn't want 1 more? Then probably not. So I think there's a lot of factors there that kind of come into play. This one, it sounds like it's pretty important to OP to have at least 1 other kid. But yeah, maybe work on your relationship first and try to get on the same page and try to build a deeper sense of connection and a deeper understanding of each other and your wants and needs before you make any decisions here. So I would appreciate this. Now, a lot of people actually say something similar along the lines of, okay, people say things in relationships, especially early on, and especially when you haven't had kids before, where you can kind of sit there and be like, oh yeah, it'd be amazing to have 4 kids. And then you have your first child and you're like, oh my God, this is a lot. I don't think I can handle anymore. So yes, people do say things early on in the relationship that maybe in hindsight they shouldn't have said. And so that's kind of where a lot of people come at this type of question from. So this person says, I wouldn't make any decisions right now. I knew I wanted a second, and my husband was very clear that he was done. We agreed to wait until our son was 2 years old to discuss it. Now my son is 2 and I'm pregnant with the second child. So it seems that the husband here changed his mind. This one replies, I would end the relationship over this. I'm on the opposite end with you though. We discussed, we wanted to have at least 2. This was a deal breaker for him. After 12 years trying to conceive, multiple miscarriages, 2 ectopic pregnancies, and a high-risk pregnancy, and a complicated birth, I do not want any more children. My husband and I were at an impasse for weeks until he told me that he is willing to leave me to have more children with someone else. I was definitely hurt, but I have to respect and accept that he wants more children, and I do not. I told him that I was okay with his decision to do whatever makes him happy. He regretted his ultimatum and took it back. We're still together and have not discussed having more children since. I'm only 17 weeks postpartum, so I may change my mind in the future, but I will not stay with someone that does not respect my mental and physical health for their own happiness. For me, it was due to my physical health concerns, but for fathers, I could see it would be mental health. We can't really force them to have more children and be happy about it if they didn't want to in the first place. And that's exactly the case. Like, it's a pretty toxic environment to bring a child into. If one of the parents is really like, I did not want this kid, then that's not good. If you decide to have kids, then it should be a mutual decision under all circumstances. And that's kind of the part where it's like, okay, if you are not able to compromise on it, then where would you go from there? OP says, which I think is a pretty rough comment, she says, the thing is, I'm the only one who's been doing all the hands-on parenting, and he does work a lot. So honestly, his life wouldn't change all that much with another kid, except maybe financially. Maybe that's why I have a hard time wrapping my head around it all. I think that's a pretty terrible attitude, both in terms of excusing the fact that he's maybe not as hands-on as he should be as a father, and saying, well, it's not that big of a deal for him. I'll be the one doing all the work anyway. that's not a good attitude to have when it comes to choosing to have more kids. Definitely, there's a lot more that goes into it, and it's not a question of finances. And if you're approaching it from the side of, oh, well, it's just a little bit of extra money that he has to spend, then the father-kid relationship that's happening here is a terrible one, and you should really be changing that. The final comment that I would read here is from this person, and she says, I wouldn't have married my husband if I was willing to leave him over the amount of children we do or don't have. So no, I wouldn't. And that's pretty cool. Like I find it kind of awesome that there are people like this who say, hey, this is not a deal breaker for me. I kind of, on some level, compare it a little bit to the idea of sex in marriage. And so if you end up as a wife saying, hey, look, you know what, I never want to have sex ever again, then as a husband, or vice versa, you know, it doesn't matter which spouse says this. But if you make that as a decision, of course, it's completely 100% within your rights to decide that for yourself. But then it means that there's a foundation in your relationship that's really damaged. And that's a problem. And how do you work past that without one of you compromising is really difficult for me to imagine. So I think fundamentally compromise is important, including when it comes to the number of kids that you have. But maybe this is one of those conversations that you should also have early on. And maybe it's also largely influenced by the types of backgrounds that people come into a relationship with and so on. So whether they had lots of siblings or not. Thankfully, me and my husband are on the same page when it comes to the number of kids that we want to have. And so that is the ideal. That is what I would suggest that everyone try to find and agree on as soon as possible.